American Society of Clinical Psychology. Case study. Andrew Benjamin Poston. Age 27. Height 5'11". Weight 168 pounds. Symptoms: stress, anger, sleeplessness, restless and intrusive thoughts, suicidal ideation, depression, panic, paranoia. Diagnosis: schizophrenia, panic/depressive disorder compounded with thoughts of suicide. Case study details. Andrew Benjamin Poston, age 27, referred by Kenneth Oberman, ND. Subject has displayed thoughts of suicide and, as evidenced by multiple flesh wounds around the torso, engaged in self-harm. Subject has reached DSM, 5 guidelines for a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which includes both auditory and visual hallucinations. Standardized measurements of process have been applied with regard to outcome after 28 days. Subject maintains lack of verbal communication with doctors or staff. Patient refuses to acknowledge injuries induced through stated self-harm and blames it on his hallucinations, which he's not went into further details about. Subject's refusal to eat has resulted in an application of sedatives and orogastric feeding tube as necessity against patient's will. Oral application of antipsychotic olanzapine and select serotonin reuptake inhibitor fluoxetine continued with a more powerful dosage of the former, as hallucinations seem to persist and strengthen since date of intake. Diary, 11th of February 2020, 12:04 a.m. I've never really kept a diary before. Listed above is basic intake analysis about this patient. In case anything happens to me, I'd like this all to be on record when they find it. I'm in a bad situation, and I'm just biding my time. I'm a mental health nurse in Western Psychiatric Clinic, or simply Western Psych. Just a little over a month ago, the above-named patient was admitted to our facility, and I was put on as his head nurse. The day he got there, they wheeled him down our corridor while in a trance-like state. He called his mother earlier that day and told her that he would hang himself in his shower head, stating that his own shadow was attacking him and that his skin was burning. This proved accurate, as he'd been admitted with observed frostbites of his upper extremities. Bad enough frostbite can cause a feeling of burning, culminating in amputation with 3 fingers on the left hand and severe lacerations of the skin. However, there was no good reason for this to happen to him. The temperature outside was 63 degrees. The first thing we did upon his arrival was to give him a basic physical, and upon examination of his apparent self-inflicted wounds, he explained in a very obvious delusional state that the cuts were a result of being attacked by an invisible person. I've gotten a lot of these types of patients, usually schizophrenics and epileptics, people who have just crossed wires in the brain. Such a declaration resulted in involuntary commitment to the Crisis Stabilization Center, a wing of the hospital where, let's just say, patients are observed a little more closely than others. His wounds were deep, long, and becoming infected. We had to put him on a bevy of different antibiotics to treat his sepsis, now attacking him in his blood. The infection rendered him mostly incapacitated, which I hated, seeing as I was the one cleaning up after him, which made me a little more queasy than other nurses. Clearly the cuts were self-induced, at least upon initial inspection, but there was a glaring contradiction from the doctor's initial suggestion of him being the cause of his own wounds. One long tear into his flesh had run from his back of his neck down to his buttocks. Injuries that could not have been plausibly explained by Andrew himself. However, the doctors brushed over the contradiction simply to round another patient into the stable. Had he done this to himself, Reaching behind, the cuts would have been uneven, serrated, and sort of all over the place. His were not. It was one long vertical carving at precisely the same depth all the way down, in the direct centre of his back, perpendicular to the spine. That wound sank into his flesh more than a quarter of an inch, unusually deep. And what's more disturbing, just below the tip of the cut was the beginning of another, as if someone was carving him out like a turkey, but stopped in the middle of it to tend to something else. The vertebrae of the spine, 24 tiny bones running up the middle of the back, is precisely about 0.32 of an inch under the skin of a person with considerably low body fat. 8 centimeters from death or paralysis. As a matter of basic physiology, the cut couldn't have killed and been himself, inflicted by himself, unless he was accurate in a 1 in a million shot. He hardly moved or spoke the first day. I think what really unnerved me about him was his pretending to be asleep. I'd walk in the room and his eyes would be shut. I'd look down to fiddle with the keys or clasp his blood pressure cuff, and quickly pick my head up to see him with his eyes opened, shutting them the precise second I looked into him. This didn't happen just once. It happened all the time. It gives me the creeps. Andrew's hallucinations generally reach their peak during daylight hours, almost always between 3 and 4 p.m. Andrew has never shown to be violent towards others, but there is a tangible sense of unease that I and the nurse's assistants experience upon entering his room around this time. A stinging in the air by a horde of tiny electric wasps. At least now, that's how best I can describe it. It's a static zing all over, from head to toe, and it goes away as soon as I walk out the door. Almost unbearable discomfort. I halfway speed through my tasks when I'm in that room, and the shades of light and darkness, the soul and the shadows, seem to imbue more depth and contrast than in any other part of the hospital. And I swear the shadows move. But I sum it all up to a movement of the sun, or reflections of cars below. Andrew says very little, but what does come out of his mouth just makes me cringe. As simply as I can put it, just yesterday morning, he was lying on his side, facing the door, with the pillow over his head. I told him that it was time for his morning meds. He told me something that gave me goosebumps. He said, "Please come close the blinds. I can see Jesus' face on the wall, and he's crying." I quickly looked at the formation of glare on the wall through the window from the morning sun. I could see it too. Jesus weeping. I just ignored it. I'm letting this paranoia get to me. Keep it together. It's like I'd prefer we leave him to his own devices during these strange bouts of paranoia. But unfortunately, this is the time of the day when he appears most frightened and is most likely to try to harm himself. This just doesn't make sense with this patient. Every few days we end up having to dress new wounds appearing on his skin, which is generally the front and back of his torso, signalled by his incessant moaning or sobbing. On 3 occasions I entered his room for a vitals check and observed a conversation between Andrew and someone in the corner next to the window. "Who are you talking to, Andrew?" I'd ask. "It's a demon, pretending to be my mother. Can you tell it to go away? I can't handle the smell anymore." "What does it smell like, Andrew?" I'd further inquire. "A rotting animal. Sometimes a garbage dumpster," he'd explain. Surely this was another delusion, that the problem with that is that I would begin with his blood pressure reading. He would continue to talk to an invisible figure in the corner. And one of those times, I watched him speak words to perfect enunciation, and his lips didn't move at all. I saw an old ad for a position as a psych nurse at our city's penitentiary, and I seriously considered it, just to get away from Andrew. Ever since, I've just procured an orderly or guard to stand in the room with me at all times, explaining that I simply feared that he might physically assault me. It was terrifying and utterly unexplainable. Andrew has been and is currently on suicide watch. After he'd screamed in the middle of the night, Andrew has been on his coat, and what looked like rope burn appeared around his neck upon inspection, with either an armed guard or medical professional keeping a close and physical eye on him in the day and night. And not once was he acted in such a way which would appear like he's doing anything at all to cause lacerations or marks. He's also begun to mysteriously acquire some bedtime stories, and things are getting worse. Andrew has now been moved to a more isolated wing of the hospital, away from other patients, just so that we can leave his door open and watch him look around the clock. And yet, he rarely moves, and never has been found brainwashing anything sharp or coarse, which would in any way explain his injuries. Last week, an orderly was delivering Andrew his lunch. Andrew has been seated up and wrapped up in his blanket, arms crossed over his knees. All morning into the afternoon, shaking and staring at the corner. The orderly was so freaked out over the situation that he called me to him and do a check. I looked into Andrew's eyes. They were wide, his pupils were dilated, and his resting heart rate had reached 155 beats per minute. His pulse had skyrocketed. His forehead was dripping with sweat, and he repeatedly complained about the man in the corner. His forehead was dripping with sweat, and he'd repeatedly complained about the man in the corner. Bent down in striking pose, staring at him, giving him angry, menacing looks, taunting him, telling him to kill himself or spend eternity rotting in hell. Now I know why he was stopped in his blanket. His skin has made me cold as ice. He wasn't shaking because he was nervous. He was shivering because his limbs were absolutely freezing. Nobody could explain it. However, we were instructed to immediately get him into a hot bath. When he stripped himself of his gown, it was just horrific. A macabre mix of blood and pus oozing out of cuts and scrapes all over, like he'd been picking apart his skin all day with tweezers. Cuts, carves, digging and open sores. The smell coming from him was awful. Beth, an assisted nurse, literally vomited into the sink. We had a doctor immediately rush into the room and sedate him. Missy, who was on next shift, replaced me, and I ran into my car and came home. Thank God. 11th of February 2020, 12:44 a.m. The hospital is currently in an active threat situation. This is what Missy, the floor's head nurse, when I'm not on. And one of my best friends just texted me. A state of lockdown, nobody in and nobody out, until cleared by authorities. She's locked in the nurse's station with Bella, another nurse and veteran of 26 years. I've never seen Bella this frightened before. She's a mess right now, she texted. This is my day off, and all I can do is think about Andrew and all of the crazy shit I've been seeing. I texted her early that day and told her I was ready to put in a transfer or quit. He was seeing all kind of things today. Those hallucinations had gotten worse, but then again, they'd always been doing so. What she told me next has me, I can't even describe, but it motivated me to lock my door and shut the lights off. I only walked away for a second, she began. And then I went back, and his window was opened. The police, they're everywhere. I don't know what to say, I replied. She continued, he talked about you today. The reason I left him was because... What? I impatiently replied. I'm sorry, Missy, for seeming so angry at the moment. If you read this, realise I know you were only trying to help me. I'm keeping with this as my only diary entry. I must finish it. Missy texted me only a few minutes ago that, well, let me just type out her text verbatim. He told me your exact address and he said he would find you. I left his room to tell the doctors, and then he was gone. I just received a call from the hospital administrator. She said, keep your doors locked. We're sending over a cruiser to watch your apartment for the night. But these are the last words I'm typing, because I hear scratching noises on the outside of my front door, and what sounds like tapping on my window. I live on the ground floor, and I'm too afraid to look outside. Pray for me. My dad died when I was 10 years old of an inoperable brain tumour. I'll never forget that final night, watching him die. He was still at home. My mom didn't want him in an unfamiliar place and also wished for him to die comfortably. My babysitter was called to take me for the night. I knew why, but I still asked my mom if he was going to die. He was shaking, choking, coughing, and staring towards the wall, but from the look of his gaze, not at it. He was looking into something invisible to me, or so it seemed. I've never seen a look like that before, but then again, I'd never seen a person in the last few hours of life clinging to it with a relentless, horrible disease. Before we left, I asked my mom, "Is Dad going to die tonight?" "No, honey. Daddy will be alright." She kissed me, and I kissed Dad on his forehead, and we left. I was still so worried about him that I called her at 12:30 a.m, asking if he was dead. "No, Daddy's okay, honey. Get some sleep." And I did. It was a burden off of my back. People think it's wrong that I never went to his viewing or funeral. What they don't understand is that the last time I saw him, he was alive. And I didn't want to see his dead body. I wanted just a shred of plausibility in my brain that he possibly may have just left and will eventually come back home. The next morning I came home. My entire family was there, and the moment I walked in, the conversation halted, and my mom kneeled down and told me, "Daddy's gone." I ran to my room and shut the door. What happened after was a blur. As months, even years passed, I would have these recurring dreams about him. In the dream, we would get a knock on the door. I'd look through the peephole and then excitedly swing the door open. Dad had come home, but he wasn't the same. He looked like my dad, but also like some half-dead incarnation of Gus from Pet Sematary 2. Skin extremely pale, eyes a reddish pink, covered in lesions. A walking disease spreader. And just before I'd go to let him in by opening the screen door, my mum would run to me, screaming "No!" and would shut the door at him, telling me he's not Daddy anymore. These were only dreams, but strange things had begun occurring months before this, and not long after his death. My mum put some sort of adhesive glue over the peephole to our door on the outside, so I couldn't see through it. And also, I was told to never open that door unless she said so. But it's almost always going to be no. We began to get persistent knocks at our door, maybe once a month, for 2 years or so. If the doorbell rang, my mum would give me permission to open it. But if it was that slow rapping at the door, I was told to go to my room. I'd come down 10 minutes later to find her crying and smoking in the kitchen. I asked, but she wouldn't tell. I was grounded if I didn't run to my room when this happened, over and over again, repeatedly, until she was nearing a breakdown state. Then, one day, it happened. When I was home alone for 5 minutes while my mom ran down to the street to the store. "Knock, knock, knock." I stayed put. "Knock, knock, knock." "No, I won't do it." louder. Knock, knock, knock. Then it stopped. I went against Mom's demands and opened the door. Waiting across our yard was a man, but I could only see the back of him. He was wearing a sweater and sweatpants. His head was shaved, but there was something else. I had to squint to see it, before recoiling in horror. Running down the back of his head, there were large black staples, like the type they suture a head together after a major brain surgery. "Dad?" I called out, faintly. He stopped, just for a second, and then walked off into the woods. He never turned to look in my direction. "Dad, I just want this to be over. I've missed you so much. I hope someday I'll know what really happened." Something happened in 2013. It was brief, but it changed me forever. And I believe in the realm of the spirits and, most especially, the realm of the demonic. My wife would usually be out of the house to work by 7 a.m. I'd not get home until 4 a.m. from work, which meant I'd be sleeping up until early afternoon. I awoke on a Wednesday afternoon to find my wife in bed next to me. In the beginning stages of waking up, I didn't really look at her closely, just felt her warmth nestled against me, lying on her side, facing me. It must be about 6 a.m, I thought to myself. So I shut my eyes to go back to sleep. What was odd, though, was that she didn't sound like she was asleep. Sleeping people generally give off deep, relaxed, slow breaths. I didn't hear anything coming out of her, but I was half asleep and didn't read into it. I fell back asleep. I woke up once more to find her in the same position, only closer. Her hot breath penetrating my left ear in fast, rapid breaths, almost like she was hyperventilating. I could feel that her head was on my pillow and not hers. Again, very strange. She typically would always be far over on her side, facing the other direction. Eyes still shut, half asleep still, I reached to the table next to me and looked at my phone. 2:17 p.m. What? I wiped my eyes and turned in her direction. Her being so close to my face, I had to literally back up to get a look. My wife was fucking staring at me, right into my eyes, her breathing laboured and racing like she'd just run a marathon. And what unsettled me most was that her pupils were dilated so much that her iris was black. Big black eyes, mouth hanging open, a puddle of drool soaking my pillow, running down her chin. I was so startled that I flipped off my covers and jumped out of bed, eyes wide with terror. I started to back up towards the door, and as I did so, her body, stiff and almost contorted, stayed frighteningly rigid. Those eyes, they followed me around the room, regarding me with palpable ire. I slowly stepped around to the front of the bed and watched her black eyes follow me, eventually disappearing into the sides of her sockets as she continued to lay still. I made my way round the bed to her side, staring at the back of her head, and then pulled the covers down over her, revealing a rigor mortis, like rigidity. I couldn't see her face, but as I moved in to put my hand on her, I heard a low-pitched growling noise emanate from her mouth. Grrr. Babe, are you okay? Grrr. Babe, honey, please say something. Grrr. Stop fucking with me, I cried out in terrified desperation. This is when she slowly rolled over towards my direction. She rolled over and laid flat on her back, staring into me with those piercing black pupils, and her mouth began moving. She was speaking in a tone that was barely audible. I apprehensively sat on the edge of the bed and moved closer to her to hear what she was saying. It was gibberish, like she was whispering in tongues. And all the while speaking, she continued to gaze at me with those horrible eyes. I could feel her hatred, its hatred, silent and visible, searing my flesh and radiating through my bones. Pure, crystalline, unadulterated hatred. Subsuming my being, infecting my spirit. Finally, I had enough. I grabbed hold of her and began to shake her awake, prompting a violent fit of screaming and thrashing, uncontrollable rage, until finally she went into a seizure, joints locking up in a contorted form, shaking uncontrollably, eyes rolling into the back of her head, frothing at the mouth. She was an epileptic, and so I put 2 phenobarbital pills into her mouth and pinched her nose to get her to swallow. And finally, she fell out of it and shut her eyes. I laid next to her as she slept the next hour or so, before finally waking up in a state of confusion. "What time is it?" she asked. 10 after 3, I told her. "Oh my God, I slept through my entire work shift?" No babe, you didn't. You were awake for several hours." "What?" I proceeded to tell her everything. At first she told me I was just trying to scare her, but she could see the earnestness and sincerity in my face as I told her the story, before tears welled up in both of our eyes. And then she proceeded to tell me something, well, disquieting to say the least. She said, "I had horrible dreams that night. Just before I woke up, I dreamt that I went into the kitchen in the middle of the night, grabbed a kitchen knife, came back, and stabbed you to death in your sleep. I just kept stabbing you, over and over, laughing while you spat blood all over yourself. And after you died, I just kept on stabbing, until you were unrecognisable. And then I fed you to the raccoons." We hugged and thanked God that this episode was over. For a moment, I chalked it up to her epilepsy. That is, until we went downstairs and we collectively gasped in utter terror at what we saw. Nearly all of our drawers were opened, and spread across the kitchen table were knives. Every single one that we owned. She doesn't remember any of it, and less than a month later, we had the house blessed. And ever since, nothing like that has ever occurred again. I can't help but shudder at the idea that while I was asleep, she physically left the room, took out all of those knives, came back, and just lay there, staring at me, for God knows how long. Ugh. After my last relationship ended, I began to engage in a lot of irresponsible behaviour. One of them going on Tinder to find someone to just have sex with. Unconsciously irresponsible, to my own detriment, I was disregarding using condoms, sleeping with a girl who had HPV, and meeting up with a few other shady partners up for a one-night stand. I'm sure much of this had to do with mild depression. After maybe a little over a dozen hookups, I'd met a gorgeous ebony girl in her early 20s, down to, well, you know. She gave me her address and we agreed to meet up the same night. I knew a neighbourhood, what you would consider a bit unsavoury, made up mostly Section 8 duplexes. So I was of course on guard. This town has the second highest murder rate in the city. I followed the GPS which led me to a house without any lights on, inside or outside. The house was directly across the street from the bad neighbourhood. I'm a white boy in a mostly black neighbourhood, something by now I was used to, since I'd mostly been on a streak of hooking up with black females. I made a few laps before calling her. It rang once or twice each time, but she abruptly hung up. However, I did get a text. We'll call the girl Jasmine. The exchange went as follows, verbatim, as I'm going back and forth from my actual text messages to her. Jasmine: "Hey, where you at?" Me: "I think I'm here. You live in a house or duplex?" 5 minutes go by without a reply, and then they started again. Jasmine: "Where you at?" "I think I'm on your street. 514 Drive, right? All I see is a house on the corner." 2.5 minutes pass. Jasmine: "I ain't gonna stand out here all night, bro." Me: "I've been asking you if you live in that house. The house on the corner." 3 minutes pass. Jasmine: Bruh, where you at? Yes, red house on corner. At this point, I pull over and decide to stake out the house. I tell her my car was white. It was actually dark blue. Me, okay, yeah, I know where you are. I gotta turn around and come back, but be there in 30 seconds. As I'm watching, I see a black girl come out of the house, all lights still off, onto the porch, phone light illuminating her face. I couldn't get a great look, but she did resemble the girl in the profile pics. Next, I watch from the house across the street. 2 tall black males exit and run to her house. Both wearing dark hoodies, hoods up, and they both enter. But not before I see a third, really big, older black male open the door for them. Jasmine, bruh, you coming or what? Me, about to pull up now. Come upside. Aight, outside. I take my gun out from my glove box, and instead of just leaving, I did something potentially very dangerous. I turn on my headlights and pull alongside the house and roll down my window. She's on the steps, leering down into her phone, before I call out, Jasmine? She looks at me and then says, hey, I thought you were driving a white car. Am I good to come in? I ask. Yeah, you good. Why are you asking me so many questions? I smiled and simply said one thing. Nice try. In that moment, just as I was pulling away, she flashed me a grin. Not a friendly or flirtatious grin, but one which obviously said, you're very lucky. About 1 minute later, I got a text. Jasmine, why you punk out? Me, I didn't. I saw your 3 friends go in there. They my cousins. You a bitch. No, they ain't. The entire house was pitch dark. I'm not stupid. Then, I got one more text, affirming my worst suspicions. A brief, albeit frightening one. Jasmine. Haha. She blocked me after that. I'd like to say it was my last time using Tinder. However, from then on, I'd only meet people in public places. I'm currently in a relationship with someone I didn't meet online. Just be careful out there.